Welcome to Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our website is libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today, we are discussing with director Michael Miller his new award-winning documentary, PovertyCure, about entrepreneurial solutions to poverty. Michael Miller is a research fellow at the Acton Institute and director of the PovertyCure initiative at Acton. He speaks extensively in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Europe on ethics, culture, economics, and philosophy. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Let's just talk first off, this documentary, PovertyCure. Tell us overall, what is this about? What are you trying to communicate and make real to viewers?
Well, so PovertyCure begins with really the human person with creative capacity. And so we tend, I think when we see people in poverty, we tend to say, and I think this is right? We tend to say, what can I do to help the person in poverty? And that's a good question. But I think there's a better question. And what we talk about at PovertyCure is that the better question is not what I can do, but rather, how do people in the developing world, how do people in poverty create prosperity for their families and their communities? And so this is the kind of the core idea. That it sounds like a simple shift in semantics, but it's actually a shift in our focus. It takes the focus off of us and puts the focus where it belongs, on people who can create prosperity for their families and communities. And it also does, I think, something else, and that it's, instead of us asking, why is there poverty, right? I mean, poverty is pretty much the standard way most people have lived throughout history. So the real question is not why is there poverty, but why is there wealth? How is it possible that some people have been able to create wealth and prosperity for their communities and their nations? And is there something we can learn from that? So that's the kind of message of PovertyCure. And then the PovertyCure DVD series is a 6-part DVD series that examines these things. We did about 150 interviews. And I will actually make one distinction. So I'm actually right now directing a documentary, a full-length feature documentary that will be out this year. We're in the last stages here of editing and post-production in the next couple of weeks. And so that will be a documentary for general audiences, and we're going to submit to film festivals. But the PovertyCure DVD series, many of the same themes, of course, is a 6-part DVD curriculum. And it's also deals especially also with some of the contributions that Christianity brings to the ideas of development, and also addresses Christian charity more directly, say, for example, than the upcoming documentary will, which is more for general audiences. But it's been really interesting. We've done about 150 interviews for this project, and everybody from the president of Rwanda to very well-known development economists like Paul Collier, who wrote The Bottom Billion, to Marcela Escobari, who's the director of Harvard's International Center for Development, to entrepreneurs, factory owners, and even small micro entrepreneurs in very poor places. So it's been interesting to hear about their experiences and what they say, and then be able to kind of take those ideas and weave them into this project. So it's been interesting. But that's the main themes are really rethinking the way we think about charity, the way we think about social justice, and the way we think about poverty. Because too often, the way we deal with poor people, not because of bad intentions, but too often, we turn people into the objects of our charity instead of the subjects or the protagonists of their own story of development. And too often, again, despite good intentions, sometimes our charity has actually made things worse.
So I want to focus in on that last statement, because I think that's preeminent in the documentary. That is the notion that we, as you say, make them the objects of our good intentions rather than seeing them as human actors, protagonists, as you say. I want to think deeply about that, because that's really an anthropological commitment to the human person as a free and relational being who seeks to use his freedom in ways to deepen his own life. and that of others. But let's think about this common Western aid approach. PovertyCure is, of course, I take it, pushing back, not being political, but trying to push back against that. But we've also seen other efforts, Bill Easterly, Dambisa Moyo, perhaps even most popularly, even Bono of U2 and rock and roll fame, all seem to be writing and understanding and articulating a really different message that state and private charitable aid actually creates a lot of real problems. I want to think even a country closer to America. I mean, much of the documentary focuses on Haiti. I mean, it focuses on African nations, but Haiti, I think I've read there is one aid worker for every 65 people in that country. And so the problem, and as you highlighted, it isn't that there aren't enough resources going in, but it's all of these misaligned incentives, misaligned philosophical understanding of the person that's creating these sort of bad opportunities. Where do you see this debate going in the future? Have you seen the sort of shift that I think others have seen?
Well, I think there's a couple things there, and let me make one point really quickly. So, as I said, I'm finishing up a full-length feature film documentary on some of these same topics, where we actually deal with Haiti quite a bit. We don't deal with Haiti so much in the PovertyCure DVD series, but in the upcoming film, we do address some of the issues in Haiti. And one of the things that's interesting about Haiti, right, is that some Haitians call Haiti the Republic of NGOs. Because there are more NGOs per capita than anywhere else in the world. Some estimates say 10 to 12,000 NGOs in Haiti, and so so I think that there's sometimes in our desire to help, I wonder if we've created a poverty industry, and I think this is part of the problem with foreign aid. So let me try to parse out some of your questions. I mean, one, let's begin with the anthropological commitments. I think that, and again, I want to be clear, you probably hear me say this a couple times and throughout the interview, and hopefully not overly tedious, but I do think in discussing these things that most of the people, not everybody, okay? I mean, some people are in it for big money because there's a lot of money in the poverty industry. But most of the people who go into helping poor people and who even become part of the poverty industry are not bad intended people. And so I think we need to make this clear. I mean, like Bill Gates and Dambisa Moyo disagree on certain things. Okay, Dambisa Moyo is critical of foreign aid. I tend to agree with her. I'm critical of foreign aid too, and we can talk about that a little bit. Bill Gates supports foreign aid, and at one point, Bill Gates was asked about Dambisa Moyo, and he said, that her position is evil.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I mean, that's preposterous. Okay. I mean, I think it's a little bit overboard to call people evil. I think we can disagree without doing it. I mean, let me say, we can talk about this too. I think there are some intrinsic moral evils that go on in the poverty industry. One of them being that developing nations fund abortions in the developing world, right? Which is deeply problematic on a moral level, and also it's like cultural imperialism and colonialism to the highest order.
I think
we can talk about the moral evils of that, but I think but pulling back from this, I mean, I think that Bill Gates saying that Dambisa Moyo is evil because she disagrees with aid is silly, right? I mean, I don't think Bill Gates is evil because he likes aid. Okay, I think good people can disagree. So, but I think some of it goes to this anthropological question. I think that unintentionally we look at people as I said before, the objects of our charity or the objects of our compassion, and that oftentimes we use this humanitarian model, which is really a hollowed out view of Christian charity. And it's hollowed out, and because it's focusing mostly on providing goods and services, the needs, comfort, etc. Okay, I mean, if you want to go, I know you get into the philosophical questions. I mean, Max Shaler wrote a very interesting essay on how humanitarianism is a ressentiment-based approach to life, right? Transvaluation, that it takes the most important things and puts them down, and puts lower things like comfort and their needs higher. And I think there's some truth to that. Why? Because the goal of charity, right, is to help promote human flourishing, to help other people flourish so they can succeed in this life. And Christian charity, of course, takes this to the end of their ultimate end of life with God, right? Their eternal destiny in mind. But just in the natural realm, charity is about helping people to flourish as human beings. And I think too often the humanitarian model is more focused on how we can come in and help instead of how we can help in partnership to help them create the conditions so they can provide for themselves and create prosperity for themselves so they don't need our help.
And
okay?
It seems to me that
so I think there's this anthropological question. Does the human person have creative capacity? Or, as Theodore Dalrymple says, I think you've interviewed him before. Theodore Dalrymple said, I interviewed him for this project, he said, are people somehow different from us? Are the poor somehow incapable of taking care of themselves? And I think underlying a lot of our ideas, and again, these are not bad intended, there's this sense that somehow poor people are radically different from us and they just can't succeed without our help. And I think that's false. I mean, sure, there are some people who are always going to need help, but for the majority of the world's poor, they're not poor because they lack stuff. They're poor because they lack the institutions of justice that enable them to create prosperity for their own communities. And I think that's an underlying anthropological problem.
Yeah, I want to just continue this line of thought because as I'm watching your documentary and this kind of, large, thought is present, large observation about the problems of aid. When we look to Western nations, and I know we're not just talking about state-to-state aid from the West flowing into these impoverished nations and regions, we're talking about foundations, charities, NGOs. All of these, though, largely staffed and led and governed by the Western worldview of the last 100, 200 years that largely sees man as sovereign, atomistic, materialistic, fed and led by things other than a really deep appreciation, I think, for human flourishing in community, in relationships, and also seeing knowledge as something that we can really appropriate and govern and construct through our will, rather than, and I think you're working from just your epistemology in the way this documentary approaches economics and law, something more along the lines of the Scottish Enlightenment, we might say, or Austrian economics, which, ultimately is building upon person-to-person interaction, and that knowledge is never complete. It's always been, and it's always inherently localized, and that has to be kept in mind when we're thinking about how people deal with one another. I want to think about business development in Africa and this idea of charity that hurts, because there are a lot of micro examples you point to in the film of business development actually being imperiled or impaired, I should say, by the type of aid that we dish out to those nations. You have a couple of good examples. One that I thought was interesting and one I want to talk to you about was the T-shirt and the secondary clothes example flooding into certain nations. And you have Kenya there. Some people alluded to this as actually a bad thing for the development of textiles and cotton industry in these countries. Let me ask you about that. Why is that?
Well, I think that you brought up two things. Let's address that one first, and we can go back to your
Sure.
question about this, what I would call a social engineering approach,
Yes.
which is part of the problem with
Yes.
the poverty industry. I think we have to ask, okay, what's the goal of our charity? What's the goal of our assistance? If the goal of our assistance is simply to give them stuff, then, T-shirts don't really hurt, right? But if the goal of our charity and aid, which is usually stated to be to help alleviate poverty, get them out of poverty, World Bank, create a world without poverty, all these things, right? If that's the goal, then we have to ask ourselves, are big donations helping? And sometimes they can help in emergency situations, but more often than not, we have taken the emergency crisis model of aid, and we've used that as the model for economic development. So, it's the example in the DVD series about T-shirts come in, and there are local T-shirt manufacturers, there are local clothing manufacturers, and when free things come in, it distorts local markets, and they can't compete because it's very hard to compete with free things, right? And T-shirts are one example. I mean, shoe drops, are another example. I mean, the modern shoe drop, of course, is Tom's Shoes, right? Tom's Shoes is very, hip and fashionable, but the idea is, you buy a shoe here, and then we give one to somebody in the developing world. Well, okay, that's good for some of those people in the short term, but what about the communities? What about the shoemakers in that community? Right? Are they benefiting from that?
So would you would...
And Tom's, by the way, is trying to change its model. I don't know if it's changed its vision, but he's trying to change its model, Blake Mikowski. But I think but it's the same question, like, what's the long-term benefit? Same thing with agriculture, right? I mean, we talk about this in the series. So what we do in the United States and Europe is we subsidize our agriculture, often putting up tariffs as well. We overproduce. Then we send our agriculture to the developing world, either as aid or artificially cheap, subsidized, and we give them food. Okay, they have food. But what's the goal? Is our goal to simply give them food, or is our goal to, quote-unquote, create a world without poverty and end poverty and all these things that we hear, right? Ending extreme poverty. If the goal is that, then it's not very effective, because what we end up doing is disempowering local farmers and local producers. And so, and the bigger problem, Richard, I mean, not the bigger, but the other problem that goes with that is, what do? We subsidize our agriculture, we send it over as aid, we disempower local farmers, and then we blame competition and free markets and say, oh, we have to protect the poor. This is not free markets and competition. This is crony capitalism. I think this is one of the other serious problems with foreign aid that I think is not talked about enough, and I think that people on the right and the left can really join in to fight. And that is, aid can create the occasions for crony capitalism. Okay, and so one of the guys I interviewed in the DVD series, a Ghanaian entrepreneur, Herman Chinwe Hesse, he told me the story. He said, "Look, 5 companies got together. We were bidding for a government project from Ghana, and they were local Ghanaian companies. So the European competitor got their country to give a soft loan to the country of Ghana, right? And the Ghanaian government said, hey, we love you guys, but nothing beats free money, right? Because it was a loan on the condition that this European company would get the business. And this is not uncommon. I mean, Dalrymple talks about this, that a lot of foreign aid ends up going to contracts to companies from the United States and Europe or Japan who could never get the contract in the real market. So foreign aid ends up subsidizing big corporations in the United States and Europe, right, and creating this crony capitalism. So the Guardian newspaper reported that out of U.S. food aid, I think it was 2012, U.S. food aid, 70% of the $1 billion went to, those contracts went to 3 big companies in the United States, right? So that who's really benefiting from the industry, right? Are the people that are benefiting the people we're trying to help, or the people who work in the poverty industry? And I think this is a question we need to ask. And it's not just crony capitalists. It's all the people who work for the United Nations. All the money that goes from foreign tax dollars goes to foreign aid that goes sent to all these NGOs, right, who are oftentimes funded by so-called non-governmental organizations, are really parastate organizations. They're government-financed organizations that become arms of the state in many ways. They're, having jobs, having interesting lives, et cetera. So the question we need to ask ourselves in the poverty industry is, who's actually benefiting the most? And this goes to the point of economics. Again, I'm not saying that bad guys got together in a conspiracy to say, let's hurt the poor. No, I think what we have created is bad incentives. We haven't taken anthropology seriously and the creative capacity of the person. We haven't taken the reality of economic incentives seriously, and we have this top-down social engineering model that somehow we in the West are just smarter and know better, and we haven't helped build the institutions that enabled us to get wealthy. Instead, we've created this poverty industry that I think is not as helpful as it could be, and sometimes harmful.
It is not altogether different from the way most liberal democracies in the West treat their own poor, or their own working class, or the way they actually create sort of points of dependency, even in the middle class. This is all. It's deeply related. I think it comes from the same basic of social engineering vision,
and a certain kind of in the developing world, a certain kind of neo-colonialism mentality. And I know that might be hard to hear, that people on the left especially
no, I think that's exactly
wouldn't want to think of themselves as neo-colonialists. But I think people on the left and the right, when it comes to this kind of developing thing, are really perpetuating a neo-colonialist model. And so one of the things I'm hoping with PovertyCure is that it's not political, as you said. I mean, it's not a right-wing piece. It's not a left-wing piece. It's really, it's critical or praiseworthy of whatever's going on. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes too much of our dealing with the developing world is shaped by kind of these internal politics. One of the guys, what did he say? The guys I interviewed, he said, there's an African saying that when elephants fight, the grass suffers, right? Yeah. And sometimes I think that when the right and the left, and say the U.S. or the UK or Europe fight, oftentimes the people in the developing world end up suffering because of this neo-colonialist position. I think if the right and the left could get together on a lot of these things, I think there would be some agreement that the way we're trying to help the poor is just not working.
Something you discuss in the documentary is a different conception of justice than one we usually think of. We usually think of, particularly in the context of Western aid to developing countries, we think of a social justice model, a notion of uplift and healthcare outcomes, education outcomes, all of these sorts of things that are that are the result of these large gifts, these large grants, these large contracts. You put forward something very different, and I think it's worth discussing in full, a notion of social justice that depends upon the rule of law and private property. And this has numerous positive effects and impacts when it's actually enforced and works, but it's not sexy, it's not attractive, it doesn't gain a lot of headlines because it's precisely this day-to-day living in the light of our responsibility that is emphasized there. Where you point to an example, if I remember correctly, in Argentina, of actually enforcing property rights in poor neighborhoods and it actually having a positive effect. Talk about that entire process. What happens when the government really prevents the poor from actually owning things with formal title?
Right. I mean, I think you bring up a couple of important points. I mean, first of all, it's interesting too because here the government does have a role. Right. I mean, sometimes in the critique of foreign aid, people say, well, don't you think the government should do something? Like, of course I think they should do something. They should help create the conditions of justice that allow people to create prosperity for themselves. And some of these are, as you point out, rule of law, right, fairness and justice in the courts. There's two elements. One is just getting access to the courts. Right. In India, for example, the backlog of courts, the backlog of court cases. This one research institute said it would take 320 years to get all the backlogs up. So people are denied justice. It takes 20 to 25 years for them to get their case heard. Plus, you have to pay for lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. So who do you think gets neglected? The poorest of the poor. They're locked out. Okay, so that's one part of rule of law, just access to the courts. Right. The second part of rule of law that's important that we talk about in the DVD series is this ability to start a business and enter into the formal economy without undue burden. Okay, and so Hernando de Soto, we give his example where they tried to set up a sewing shop, and they got 4 lawyers to go out and follow all of the rules to set up an official sewing shop in the formal economy, and it took 289 days. And this is not uncommon. In Ghana, the process is about 200 days, if I remember correctly. Oftentimes, the amount of money to get the permits is sometimes 5 or 10 or 20 times average income. So that even if you could spare all those hours to go set up your business, you can't afford it. So poor people are just locked out. I mean, they are excluded. Hernando de Soto, I think, has a very powerful line. He says the legal systems are unfriendly to poor people. And this is an area of justice that really needs to be attended to, of justice or social justice, if you want to think of it that way. Secondly, you brought up the question of private property. In 70% of the land in some countries doesn't have clear title. You don't know who owns the land. So it can be confiscated from you. You don't have the incentive to build a business because you don't have these long-term you can't have long-term horizons. And one of the studies you referred to in your question was in Argentina. They did a study where the long and short of it is that a big tract of land, they decided to make it private property and register, formally register the business. Well, halfway through there was a problem. So they had this very interesting situation for study. Half of the people in this area had private property, and the other half didn't. So they said, well, what happened? And what they found out was that private property not only has economic impact, but it actually changes the worldview of people. They saw the world differently. Their levels of trust went up, their value of education, various other things. And it was interesting because I talked to Ernesto Chargotsky, who was one of the professors who did the study along with, he's in Argentina, and Rafael Vitella, who's Argentine at Harvard. But I was talking to Ernesto Chargotsky about this, and he was explaining it to me, and I said, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas write about this in similar ways. He was taken by it. These are ideas that actually come deeply out of classical and Christian civilization, of the importance of private property to create space for family. But it's also, not just private property rule of law, this free association, right? And this is what the 289 days, the lockout of the poor people. They don't have the freedom to create businesses for themselves because they're locked out. And the other thing that's very important, that a lot of people, I think, find surprising, Richard, is what you could call the institution of justice that is free exchange. Now, we tend to think of poor people and think, we got to protect poor people from competition. But a couple of things. One, just anecdotally, a lot of people I talked to said, we don't want protection. We want access, okay? One guy I interviewed, a very interesting guy he's an American guy working in the developing world for years. He said he first got to the developing world and he had the idea, give a man a fish, eats for a day. Teach a man to fish, eats for a lifetime. And then he realized, wait a minute, that for most people in the developing world, they know how to fish. The problem is they lack access to the ponds. They don't have access. And this is why free exchange is so important. And here's especially why. When a government begins to heavily regulate an economy, who has the most influence in regulation? Well, big business, powerful interest groups, and entrenched bureaucracy. So when an economy is highly regulated, the poorest of the poor lack political, economic, and social context to navigate this system that gets dominated by bureaucracies and corporations and interest groups. So they get locked out. So it actually hurts the poor to not have free exchange because it creates situations of crony capitalism. You hear a lot around, like unfettered capitalism hurts the poor. I was at the Academy of Management giving a paper. There's a very professor from Germany, prestigious university sitting next to me, and he kept saying, the problem we have is unfettered capitalism. Finally I said, that's not true. Name country that has unfettered capitalism. 40% of the average for European state spending is 40% of GDP. The United States, 40% of GDP. Think of all the barriers and the regulations, especially that affect poor people in the developing world. The problem is for poor people is not so much that they're being dominated by markets, but they are being excluded from them. And they're being dominated by crony capitalism, right? And they're not given opportunities to have access. And I think the last thing I'll say to your question is this idea of kind of social justice and charity and how we operate. I think that we don't sufficiently focus on these institutions of justice. They're hard. They require not only political will, but they require moral transformation and spiritual transformation because wealthy people in the developing world are doing okay. They don't have the economic incentive to make everybody richer, okay? So it needs a moral transformation as well, a spiritual transformation. But here's the other thing, and the last thing I'll say about this idea of social justice. St. Thomas Aquinas says, and brilliantly, that justice is destroyed in two ways. By the violent act of the man in power, and by the false prudence of the wise sage. And I think a lot of the problems for social justice in the developing world have actually been the result of both of those things. Yes, of course, the violent acts of the powerful man, but also of the false prudence of all of the international planners, all of the people who hang out in what I call Davos capitalism, in their posh resorts and talking about how to plan the economy. And they think they're smarter than they are. And so, unfortunately, the false prudence, the inability to see the world as it is and act accordingly, the false prudence has led to injustice. And I think that's one thing that needs to change. It's going to be hard to build institutions of justice, but at least we can stop doing things that harm poor people and that prevent those things from developing.
One thinks of the difficulty, and perhaps this, the Davos capitalists you were referring to, and that network, they think of themselves, I think, as very courageous. But actually, the courage is what we've been talking about, to actually step forward and have a regime of the rule of law and private property, and one that actually allows those who are, think of the bonsai people from the documentary, maybe we can talk about that a little bit, but that idea that you should be allowed to flourish as a person in your own right, apart from these sorts of interventions. And oh, by the way, it's actually much more small-scale things that would actually provide the most benefit. That's what you've been discussing. I want to talk about another notion that's present. It's present in a lot of our economic thinking, but it's also in this Western aid model of the zero-sum game, which I think leads to this notion of, well, this is why we make large grants. This is why we have huge interventions, because I have to just give you this to satisfy you, and I've done a lot, and then I'll come back and give you more next year. And that's the idea of the zero-sum game, which leads to all sorts of ways of thinking about human beings, the objects of our compassion, et cetera, that you were discussing. So the zero-sum game, you talk about that in the documentary. It leads us to think about people as burdens and not creators. This really goes back to the beginning of our conversation. That seems ingrained and something very difficult to change. That actually, I'm a brain, I'm arms, I'm hands. I can actually create wealth if you'll just get out of the way and remedy these really destructive situations.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things going on. We've mentioned some of this before, right? That like Theodore Dalrymple said in the film, right? Do you think that people are somehow different from you, that they can't take care of themselves? I think there's an underlying sense there. So I think there's two things that are going on, really, is that there's bad anthropology. You don't understand the creative capacity and dignity of the human person, mixed with bad economics of the zero-sum game. I mean, this is the ubiquitous fallacy that is an economy is a pie, and if you have more, then I have less. And in order to remedy this, that you need to give me more so we can be equal, or at least close to equal. But economies can grow. I mean, this is an evident fact. I mean, the fact that, we're having this phone call and that you can use Skype and computers and iPhones and all of the development, I mean, economies can grow. I mean, we live in basically, like aristocrats in the past because economies can grow, right? So what happens is, two things happen. One is we said, okay, if we can just send over large sums of money, we can jumpstart development. And I think part of the zero-sum game, but I think the most insidious part of the zero-sum game has been population control. And, I think it's just, one, there's no correlation between poverty and population. Okay? Some countries that are highly populous are wealthy. Some countries that are highly populous are poor. Population densities, same thing. I mean, Hong Kong and Bangladesh, both high population density, lots of people. One's very wealthy, one's very poor.
Although we could say it is the case that depopulating nations are actually going to inevitably lose their wealth.
Populating nations what?
Depopulating nations with below replacement level growth, it's going to be hard to see how they actually grow economically.
Oh, right. Well, it's basic economics, right? What are the factors of production? Right? Land, labor, and capital, right? So labor is a factor of production. I mean, we do have demographic problems. We have a population problem, Richard, and you just alluded to it. The population problem we have is declining populations. I mean, I think there's two really good books. So you probably have read them already, but maybe your listeners haven't seen them yet. I think they're interesting. One is Jonathan Last's books called What to Expect When You're Not Expecting, which is, I think, a very interesting book. And then David Goldman wrote a book called Why Civilizations Die.
Yes.
And he talks about how birth rates are declining not only in Europe and the United States, but actually in the Muslim nations as well, in developing nations in Africa and Asia. So anyway, there's a lot of things going on here, but I think that there's a serious problem as we have spent billions of dollars trying to reduce population, even though there's no evidence that a lack of population causes that population causes poverty, and that a lack of population causes wealth. There's no evidence that there's anything going on there. And so what we end up doing is we actually undermine the productive capacity of people. But I think there's something even more insidious, and actually I would say evil. There's a moral evil going on because of our bad economics and our bad anthropology, and I would call the ideology of population control. We've been encouraging people to have small families, and they have. It works. And so we have now, what the New York Times has called the daughter deficit.
The daughter deficit, yes.
And what The Economist, I think, rightly called gendercide. It said the cover of The Economist magazine, what happened to 100 million baby girls? I mean, the birth rates, ratios of boy to girl have been completely distorted because of bad economics, the zero-sum game, right? That somehow, if we can reduce the number of people, we can make people wealthier. And, here's sometimes how I explain it, right? So imagine there's a room of 50 people, okay, and the 50 people all pool their money into the room. Okay, we empty our pockets and we pool their money into the room, and then we divide the room in half, and half of the people are dead, okay, and then we redivide the money. Do we have more money per person? Yes, for a snapshot, but we've destroyed the productive capacity of half of that room. So in the long run, we're not going to have more productivity. We're not going to have more wealth. We're not going to have more to go around because people are not simply consumers.
Yeah.
People are potential producers. And I think this is where this anthropology and economics mix together to have some really deleterious, very, very morally evil consequences. And now we face a serious challenge of not enough girls, not enough girl children. And so, I mean, the effects of that are remain to be seen, but it's not going to be pretty.
I mean, interesting, though, perhaps we should not be surprised by the intractability of these issues and these sort of ideas. Thinking just of successes, you note some of them. Bangladesh goes from a country that we're perennially worried about is going to have mass starvation, actually does have a famine in the late 70s, and yet is now a food surplus country. We have the example of microfinancing, which some people have criticized, but I think overall it stands as a success. And it certainly brings forward the idea that we can actually give loans to people and they actually turn around and create wealth with it. So that's incredible. And so we have those examples. We have comparisons. You make one with Ireland and Nicaragua, and Ireland opening up to markets and experiencing growth. Nicaragua does not. All of these things, and yet we still continue to do the same thing and the same thing. And I guess one has to just attribute this, I think, largely to who we are in the West.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think these. If you look at these kind of countries, sometimes we have this idea that countries can't develop, they can't change, and I think the example is of that somehow where poverty is this remedy that only can be remedied if we go and we give something, But I think you pointed out Ireland and Nicaragua. We use an example. They were the same.
Yeah.
They're very similar, I should say, in their size, and I think that you said the number of hospital beds, all the numbers, all these things. And Ireland began to take off, and Nicaragua kind of stayed the same. I think one of the most interesting comparisons, and we wanted to do this in the DVD series, but just didn't end up having time or space, is the comparison between Argentina and Australia. Look at Australia. Look at Argentina. About in the 1940s, 1950s, they were both two of the wealthiest countries in the world, in like the top 15, I think. And Australia has continued to rise up. It's the new economic indicators of economic freedom, which is rule of law, private property, corruption, easy to start a business, etc. Australia is third, I believe, after Hong Kong and Singapore.
Yeah, I think that's
okay.
Right.
And it's very wealthy. It has levels of freedom, very successful. The people are very wealthy. Now let's compare that to Argentina. Again, interesting, and the comparison is interesting. They're both very big places, have lots of natural resources, to very low, not high levels of native populations, of indigenous populations, in either Argentina or Australia, say, compared to other nations. European.
Argentina, the most European
migrations.
Yeah.
What's that?
Argentina, one of the most European, highly immigrant population from Europe.
Spanish and Italian mostly.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's a whole host. I mean, there's studies, books on this. But if you look at the similarities, and they have all these similarities, but there are some cultural differences and other things. But a lot of it came to, they were both wealthy, they were both successful, and then one succeeded, Australia, economically, and Argentina failed. Argentina has incredible slums, high levels of poverty, tons of crony capitalism. And so interestingly, in the Heritage 2014 report, I think I have the numbers correct here, but Australia is the third freest economy. And look how wealthy it is. And Argentina is 160th or 166th. It's basically almost repressed.
Yeah.
And so it's not that the Argentines are somehow incapable. It's that the political institutions and the economic institutions of justice have not been preserved. There's not clear rule of law. There's crony capitalism. There's not the opportunity for Argentines to actually create prosperity for themselves. And so they become poor. It's kind of populist, Peronista moves of the 40s and the 50s. And so you get this really legacy of populism that has been a serious problem. And so these are the kind of things that I don't think we pay attention to. We don't pay attention to how countries actually create wealth, how societies can succeed and how they can fail. Instead, we're kind of thinking of things in static zero-sum terms.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I guess this has been something of at times a negative conversation, but that's unavoidable. Although we should note obvious statistics of economic growth and
right.
Hundreds of millions of people coming out of poverty, really since the Cold War. I mean, wonderful things are happening. Perhaps someone should inform the Bishop of Rome of these things. But yet, there is that bottom billion, and you alluded earlier to Paul Collier's book that still are perhaps off the grid and not as connected and not able really to be connected to these circles of exchange that are global and that they could actually tie and feed into. So I guess maybe I kind of want to end the interview and just thinking going forward what you're seeing in this this realm of human endeavor.
Well, I think one, you point out, I think, something important, and we actually talked about this in the DVD series. The poverty rates basically have, I think, gone from about 52% to 22% over the last 50 years. Interestingly, I've heard some people, Christians normally make the case, like, see what charity can do? Like, no, these people did not get out of poverty because we gave them foreign aid or because of charity. They got out of poverty because they got connected to networks of productivity. Okay. Now, let's not paint a perfect picture like everything's fine. I mean, you point out the bottom billion. We also have high levels of volatility. I mean, I'm a free marketer. I think our free markets are very important. I think they're important because they help political liberty, they help protect religious liberty, and they also allow human flourishing. I also think they're very important because they help poor people. Okay. And free markets are different from crony capitalism. And I think, actually, a lot of free marketers haven't made that distinction. We need to be very, I mean, a lot have, for the record. I mean, you and I know some of them. But I think that, kind of the average way we discuss things, we haven't made the distinction between bureaucratic, managerial, crony capitalism like we have in the United States and authentic, free, competitive economies. Okay? Now, at the same time, you and I know that as good as free economies are, they're not going to save you. They're not going to create heaven on earth, right? Only Jesus can save you. So I'm not looking to the free market to save my soul. And they also have problems, right? I mean, free markets create volatility, structural changes, so they can have negative cultural effects. And so you have to mitigate those things, okay? But generally speaking, when economies are free, people, especially poor people, have the capacity to create prosperity for themselves. Okay, so I think we have to pay attention to that. But you also end up saying, talk about the bottom billion. So I think two things. One, let's not forget that a lot of poor people are actually getting out of poverty because they've been connected to networks of productivity and exchange. Okay, that's good. Two, let's not forget that just because that's happening, it doesn't mean the world's perfect, and we don't need to pay attention to some of the negative impacts of volatility and migration and all these things. We have to pay attention to those things and help mitigate them. And number three, let's not forget what Paul Collier talks about, the bottom billion. And as Pope Francis, you mentioned Pope Francis, he talks about people are excluded. They are left out, and he's absolutely right. I mean, there are millions of people who are excluded and who are left out. And so Collier talks about the bottom billion and talks about some of the traps, which I won't get into. Mm-hmm. But, whether it's a resource trap, that sometimes the paradoxical, you have resources and you think it's going to get you out, but instead it becomes the conditions for the politicization of development, right? That's exactly what foreign aid does. Foreign aid and resource traps are the same thing. They politicize development. And the other problem, of course, that Collier talks about is this bad governance, right? That we don't have enough, the poor people, I should say, don't have enough access to real institutions of justice that allows them to create prosperity. And there's another interesting book. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it's a very good book by Acemoglu and Robinson called Why Nations Fail. Yes. And they talk about the importance of political institutions. And I think they make a mistake in taking a reductionist approach to culture. I think that institutions don't develop in a vacuum. They develop actually out of a culture. I think sociology and history shows this to be the case. Nevertheless, I mean, they talk about the role of institutions. And I think that for the bottom billion and for the world's poor, there are always going to be cases, Richard, where there's tragedy, where there's natural disaster. I mean, you and I know this. Or where there's people who can't help themselves, people who just need charity. They need personal human love, right, to help them. And the state can't solve their poverty, and the economy can't solve their poverty. It's actually be people who loving care who help them. Okay, that's always going to be needed. But for the majority of the world's poor, the biggest problems is they lack the institutions of justice that enable them to create prosperity for their families and communities. And I think if we want to really change the way we're going, we need to focus on this. And the problem we have in front of us is that we have a poverty industry. And of course, if poor people become wealthy, what happens in the poverty industry? It becomes obsolete, right? So there's challenges ahead of us. I think there's some positive turns. I still think that there's a lot of underlying broken assumptions. But I think there's a wave of people recognizing, look, the way we've helped the poor really hasn't worked. Let's not have an ideological view to this. We don't have to have, it's not, you don't have to be all right or all wrong. Poverty is very complex, and there's no single solution to poverty, okay? Just like there's no single solution to how people create wealth. And we're not going to create heaven on earth, but let's at least agree that some of these things that we've done haven't been as helpful, and let's make this move towards entrepreneurial solutions to poverty. And I think that despite a lot of bad news out there, there's also a lot of good news, is that poor people are starting to get access, and we're seeing what happens. And that is, they create prosperity for their families, and they become more or less independent and able to really flourish as human beings. So there's a lot of positive things going out there, I'm hopeful. But I think prudence demands that we call things as they are, and a lot of what we've done to help hasn't really helped.
Yeah, Michael Miller, thank you so much for coming and discussing the new documentary, PovertyCure, and your efforts to resolve poverty, to alleviate it with entrepreneurial initiative. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes, and links relevant to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@libertylawtalk.org.